Well, hello, hello.
Well, hello, hello. Another exciting episode of Let's Talk.
Yes, hello, everybody. I'm Leanne.
And hello, everyone. I am Jason, and this is Let's Talk.
As usual, this is a space where no topic is off limits. We'll be covering topics from well-being, resilience, leadership, money, relationships, mindset, values is our conversation today, and so much more.
And as always, here at Let's Talk, we bring different perspectives, those real life stories and examples, and honest conversations. Because the things we don't often talk about really are the things that matter most and that we need to talk about.
Yeah. So our goal here is simple. It's to spark new ideas, shift your mindsets, and give you some practical tools that you can use in your leadership, but more importantly, your whole life.
Yeah, and so welcome back to Let's Talk. We're in series three of season one, um, titled as The Art of Intentional Living. In episode one, we talked about why we don't do what we know. In episode two, which we talked about the power of clarity and vision, which was last week's conversation. And today we're going to go a little bit deeper because it's one thing to know what you want in life, but it's another thing to actually live it and live it in alignment, um, live in alignment within it. In truth, we don't live our values, we live our patterns. And that's what we are going to unpack in today's conversation. So we're super excited. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co host, Leanne.
Yeah. And I know, Jason, this is a real passion point for you, right? Because I know in every coaching conversation, you bring up values. And in many of the conversations we've had to this day, values keeps coming up because what's important to us matters, but only if we're living in alignment to them. So, and the thing that I find, if you ask people, um, what are your values? A lot of them would say things like, well, family. They might say health. They might say freedom, honesty, success. But if we actually have a look at their calendar, at their bank account, at how they spend their time, we'd see a completely different story, right? And, truth bomb here, because I'm a bit the same sometimes, because our life doesn't actually reflect our stated values. Our life actually reflects our lived priorities. And that really challenges me and lots of people because I might value these things over here and I really value them. But if my life isn't reflecting that, then they aren't priorities to me. And I remember a girlfriend once said to me, well, that's clearly not a priority because you're not doing it. And I was so angry. It's like, it is, these values are. But I had to really sit back and think about it and go, well, she's kind of right. Like if they're not showing up, if I'm not in alignment, then they're just stated. They're not lived.
Yeah. And it's amazing that you say that, Leanne, too, because a lot of times we get into those emotional hijacks, right? When somebody actually tests us, like through your example, and you're like, no.
No. And then I had to think about it and go, oh, don't like it.
Yes. Yes. So like I think that self-awareness, kind of um not saying that, even those of us who have deep levels of self-awareness, not that saying that we're not going to have those moments of like an emotional hijack, but we can faster come to the surface to say, oh, okay, got it. You're right, actually.
Yes. Thank you. And at the same time.
Yes.
Oh, dear.
Yes. So with that, in this arena of values versus priorities, the distinction that most people end up missing is that values equals what you say matters, and priorities equals what you prove matters, right? So priorities show up in areas of like time, energy, your money, your attention. What are you giving your attention to? Like, I know we've talked, I believe it was in our very first series, I believe it was with Allie, where we were talking about intellectual mental well-being and this whole thing about time management versus like attention management. And so, it's like, well, what are you giving your attention to, right? And that really dictates what your real priorities are in the moment, whether they're conscious or subconscious, right? So at the end of the day, you can't fake your priorities because they're visible in your life, even though they may not be the priorities you want to be focusing on, but you're obviously focusing on them for some kind of reason, like I said, whether conscious or subconscious. So you can't fake it, folks. So like an example of this, like a value could be health matters to me. But in reality, there's no movement. You're getting poor sleep. You're on constant burnout mode. So you're not really living into that value, right? So it's not the value that's the problem. It's that alignment is the problem. And I know that we've talked alignment many different times in our conversation. And I really, really honestly feel that that is where most people get stuck, or yeah, I guess stuck is kind of the right word, but it's like they're out of alignment. They may not be fully out of alignment, but they're partial out of alignment. Even when you're partially out of alignment, you're still not living it.
Yeah. And that's a great example because, I say I value health, but, my actions don't always follow that, they just don't. And I think we need to really consider this in our life, especially now, right? Like there's so many competing priorities for our time and attention. And as you said, Jason, these things, this time, energy, money, attention, where we spend our time, where we're leaning into really does dictate the quality of life that we're going to have. And unfortunately, we're creatures of habits and patterns. And so a lot of this stuff is this pattern that we're habitually running that can be modified. But most people kind of believe that this is just who I am because we've run this pattern for so long, right? It's become ingrained in us. But we can modify any kind of part of this pattern of behavior. And so we've got to have a look at, what's the trigger that has me move out of alignment? What is the actions? What am I thinking that has me move out of alignment? Like what's going on? Because coming back to alignment is where our joy lies, right? And where our life really shows up, where we really show up as our best. So why do we kind of miss the boat when it comes to living our values? And I think it happens for a couple of reasons. The first one is that we've got these inherited, conditioned values that have been cast upon us by other people, because many of the values that we carry aren't actually ours. They've been cast upon us by our families, by our schools, by our social expectations, the identities that we've adopted, by the workplaces that we've worked in. All of these things come in and we take on these kind of perceived values, but it may not be what's actually in our core. It may not actually be ours that we're attached to. They've just been thrust upon us and we're living them, even though they may not necessarily be in alignment with what's truly important. So that's that first one, is that we have this conditioning or inherited value system from others. The second point here is emotional avoidance. And this one is interesting because living your values actually requires something from you, right? It doesn't just kind of happen magically. It means that we might have to lean into a bit of discomfort. We might have to stretch ourselves a little bit. We might have to go into the unknown a little bit. And that requires a little bit of oomph behind us. Like we don't
Mhm.
like the ambiguity of not knowing. So we've got to kind of get comfortable with the discomfort in order to really live into our values. The other one, and we've spoken about this so often also, is boundaries. If we don't have boundaries, if we don't protect our time, our energy, our attention, our money, all of the things, we're going to be pulled left and right by everybody else's whims and desires. So having very clear boundaries in place around this is important to me and this is what I'm sticking to, regardless of the winds that change externally. Um, it requires something from us, and most of us don't have healthy boundaries. Well, I say most, and that's kind of a gross generalization, but many people have never been taught to have healthy boundaries, and we assume having healthy boundaries makes us selfish, or we might lose those around us, we might not be liked, right? And again, so this discomfort piece is the challenge.
Can I add something real quick there, Leanne?
Please.
So when you were talking about, the boundaries, and many people don't have healthy boundaries, it makes me think about like the workplace, right? And people who, you know, like they may be dedicating themselves to, a certain company, organization, and they want to grow, right? And a lot of times they they have a loosey goosiness around their boundaries
Mm,
because they're like, well, if I'm too much A, they're going to see me as B,
mm,
so a lot of times people will compromise their values because they want to get ahead.
yeah, yeah. I
And
love that loosey goosey. Um, I
I
think
don't know if
this
that's a term there in
it is,
Australia, but
it is, it is. I've heard it before. I like it. But I would agree with that, and not just in the workplace. It happens in relationships. It happens in, family systems. It happens in lots of places because we try to avoid the hard conversations, and we don't want to be seen as so rigid. Um, but it's not about rigidity. It's about being very clear around this is what's important to me. And I think sometimes even in the workplace, we don't want to be rigid, but I think if we're looking at moving up the ladder, being able to manage your time, your priorities, your values, the organizational values is actually something that is required. But the story
yes.
we tell ourselves is very different, right? So I think that's really interesting. So the truth is that we avoid it at all costs because emotionally, it's hard work to lean into the discomfort and have the conversations and set the boundaries that we need to have. And the third part is this identity misalignment. And we've spoken to identity a fair bit over the last, little while as well. So you might value leadership, like that might be, I value leadership. I'm a strong, determined leader. But you might also identify as, I don't want to upset people. And if there's a conflict there, if your identity doesn't match your values, your behavior won't either. And so we've got to keep doing these identity check-ins, basically. We've got to keep
Mhm.
leaning in and going, is my identity living up to what I'm saying is most important to me? Because if it's not, we're going to talk the talk, but we're not going to walk it, right?
Yeah.
And for us to live the life that we want to live, we've actually got to shift that identity, shift the internal programming, um, so that we can actually do what we're called to do.
Yeah. And when you were talking through these, Leanne, to what it made me think, right, is when you got to the leadership piece, because that's like obviously where a lot of people who want to grow within an organization or company, they want to get into leadership positions, right? The decision making tables, the blah blah blahs, right? But I will tell you so many times, and I'm sure you've seen this much or many times in your executive coaching, one of the things that comes out as a misalignment or where they're feeling stuck or where they're feeling unhappy and all the et ceteras is they're out of alignment with their values.
Mm, yeah,
And
Yeah.
it's just so interesting how it's kind of like this.
This full circle. Yeah. And
Yeah.
and the other part of that is it's sometimes the conversations that we don't have are the ones that keep us up at night, mostly.
Yeah.
If it's not the ones that we do have, right? Because sometimes we've got to have the tough conversations. We've got to set the line in the sand. We've got to be stoic. And you're absolutely right. We've got to make sure that our values are aligned with the organization, because if they're not, even though you might be in that leadership position, it will eat you from the inside out, right? If there's not alignment there. So you've got to do that. But what I have found with many leaders is the conversations that they don't have because they don't want to upset people are the things that limit them. Not just them, but the other people as well, right? Like we've got to have the tough conversations. We've got to say the things that need to be said for the benefit of everybody. And if leadership is your value, then those conversations have to happen, as
Yeah.
uncomfortable as they might be. But firstly, the conversation with yourself around, am I in alignment here? Am I doing the right thing here for me first? And then how do I impact others? Because if we're kind of wishy washy, then everything around us will be,
Yeah.
or loosey goosey in your
Or
words.
loosey goosey. So next we want to move into what happens when your values are in conflict, because they do often, and this is where it gets real, because they are often in competition with one another. So what are some examples of that, right? So career success versus family time, right? Freedom versus security, that growth, whether it's personal or professional growth versus comfort, and honesty versus harmony. So, what happens a lot of times, and these are just a few examples, right? So, what happens a lot of times when your values end up being in conflict, and I do see that first one, that career success versus family time, a lot. Like I was just actually in a conversation yesterday where, it's like with like another coach, and they're like, a blank client's number one goal was to get home 2 nights a week for dinner. And if I don't, I'm going to be divorced. Right. And so those can oftentimes be in conflict with one another. So what happens is like, so the question is, so what do people do? What they end up doing many times is they avoid choosing. But not choosing is still a choice, because I hear a lot of times people are like, well, I don't have a choice between this and this. Yeah, you do.
Mm.
It's just that there's some kind of internal narrative or pattern that's happening of why you're avoiding making the choice, right? And a lot of times people don't want to discover that because it may bring up too much residue or too much, ill feelings or whatever. So they just go into in avoidance mode.
Yeah.
So, oh yeah, I'm sorry, Leanne.
I was just going to say, Jason, in the coaching that I've done over the many years, I've seen all of these show up multiple times, and I've felt them in myself also.
Mm-hmm.
Family is my number one value, but I'm also, work is also very important to me, and my contribution and making a difference, and that tension of, am I spending enough time with family, or am I spending enough time doing, the work that I'm doing? And you often see people twisting in the wind about that. The other one that I see a lot also is the growth versus comfort. Like, I want to
Mm-hmm.
move up the ladder, but this is my comfort zone, or I need to walk away from this relationship, but better the devil right? So you get this internal kind of struggle, and it's almost like head heart are in conflict, because your
Yeah.
heart kind of wants one thing, but then your head goes into all the other things. um and it's, how do we bring alignment to that, right? That head, heart, and gut kind of thing, in order to make a difference. And I think
Yeah.
this is where people get stuck in decision making, because oftentimes when they're trying to make any decision, it is that conflict between two competing priorities or competing values. And it's not pleasant to be in that spot, but not deciding is actually allowing other people then to make the decision for you.
Yeah.
And you're handing over your power as opposed to owning it and stepping into your truth.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So before we go into the next segment around turning your values into action, the key to this last section that Leanne and I were talking about is you got to have a true understanding of your hierarchy, right? And that, when people hear hierarchy, they think automatically professional, right? But there's hierarchy in your personal life too, right? So you got to understand the both hand, right? And then also the art of making conscious decisions. I mean, sometimes you just got to make a decision and then you can clean up. If you fall down, you can get up, brush yourself off. So there's lots of learning moments, but sometimes it's just make the freaking decision, right?
Yes. Just make it. And to that point, Jason, if, like you said, if you've made a decision and it ends up not being the right decision, you can just make another decision. But we put so much emphasis on having to make the right decision. But we don't know the future. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't really know, right? So just getting into action and then pivoting and adapting as you go is better than non-action complete.
Right, exactly. And I think that speaks into in the decision making realm, right? Like have as much clarity as you can, right? Because these these decisions that need to be made often fall in that knowing doing gap that we talked in the first episode, right? Because it's like, well, I know I need to do this, but the actual doing. And so like a lot of people just sit in that tug of war all day because it's like, well, if I do A, then it's like the analysis paralysis. And like you said, yeah, I mean, we don't know the future, right? And that's the thing too that I've learned about just through my executive coaching and different organizations that I've worked in is a lot of the executives, they're having those same struggles.
Yeah.
Because people are like, oh, well, they're the COO, they know. Yeah, sometimes they may have a little more data, but they have that internal tug of war too going on.
Yeah.
So, and that's just an awareness that has just grown for me. That is like, a lot of times they don't know at the time. And, they're just making the best decision that they know at the time with the data that they have. Right. So, and then the last thing is after making conscious decisions is owning the trade-offs. Right. And being aware of the trade-offs. And, it's just all these are points of data to help you move to the next step and to really like get into that action of like living into it. So,
and I also think there's something about the seasons of life in that too, Jason, because, when I was in like a lot of my values have remained the same my whole life, right? Like family's always been a priority. Contribution has always been a priority from a work perspective. Freedom has always been a priority for me. So there's these things that keep coming up over and over my whole life. But where they sit in the hierarchy shifts depending on the season in life. So in my 20s, 30s, it was all about career. But then you have children, and all of a sudden, the family thing has to become the priority. Well, for me, it had to become the priority. And I struggled with that. And then, now that my kids are kind of getting older, the season of life is changing again. I'm also, older at that point. So what's important now may not have been the same as before. And oftentimes we kind of look through the same lens without adapting. Oh, actually, I need sunglasses today, not just reading glasses. The season of life has changed, and I've got to actually look at what's important for me in this point of my life. Now, that might be different in 2 years, 5 years, 2 years ago, even. But, having that ability to have that adaptability and flexibility is so important. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think we often are rigid in our thinking, and we need to be a little bit more flexible and curious. And we
Yeah.
talk about curiosity being the cure all to everything, right? But it really
Right.
is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if we
And
make a decision
uh-huh.
and it doesn't work, it's not a fail, it's a learn, right? And we can take that lesson into the next decision that we make, and that keeps up leveling us anyway. But
Yeah.
staying stagnant, there's nothing in that that's good.
Yeah. And I do see like a lot of older individuals when they kind of get to that retirement and they get into that new phase of life, which is like many times an identity crisis, right? Like I think there's a serious values check-in that and priorities check-in that people have to do. So it almost turns in like from, like in your 20s to 30s, it's like, okay, doing an every 10-year check-in on my values, works. But I think as you get older, it's almost like, I mean, like when I say check-in, like I'm talking like a deep check-in, right? Like it almost then comes to every 5 years, because like 50 to 55 can be very different, or even 45 to 50.
Totally. And that's why you see so many midlife crisis, where all of a sudden I'm leaving the job and I'm buying a motorbike and I'm going on holidays. And that's not, it's like, oh my God, is this all it's about? Because the values that were important in a previous season have now kept us trapped. And
Yeah.
if we're not looking at them again, we're going to hit a wall.
Yeah.
And so I love that, evaluate them, evaluate your priorities regularly.
Yeah. And like one thing, and then I'll turn it back over to you for the next section.
Mm.
But in a lot of the values work that I do, I actually have clients, and for our listeners, you can do this, right? Is draw like an image of your values and almost look at it in current state and future state. And it is amazing what people can come up with if they allow their creativity to flow and to really do the work. Just that visual representation is like, oh, wow. Like,
Really, because it
I mean,
bypasses the thinking brain, right? The creative cortex. So,
yeah, exactly. Because it goes from like that feeling of like, I've been feeling this, but and then actually visually seeing it is kind of like this different level of aha that people can get.
mm,
And then it's like, okay, well, when you look at the future state of that, like now what do you feel and think and see? You
yeah.
know, so
And it's interesting, I think the other thing for us to consider here is, values are different to your strengths, you know,
mhm,
but they can, if they're in alignment, like if you're working to your strengths and your values, oh my goodness, life is good. And then last week we talked about clarity and purpose, right? So if you've got
mhm,
your vision and then you're working in alignment to your strengths and you're clear on your values, then your heart sings, really, it does.
mhm,
Like we're in the flow zone, right? We're in that sweet spot where things are, it's not to say that we don't go through hardship and that things are easy, because life always throws a curveball. But if we're in alignment to those three things, our purpose, our strengths, and our values, then we're much more resilient. We bounce forward much quicker. We're able to pivot and adapt as needed. And generally speaking, we're then that
mhm.
beacon of light for others, right? Like it's
Yeah,
almost this permissioning piece where we give others permission to stand in their strengths, their values, and their purpose. So I think it's important.
yeah, absolutely.
So let's make this a bit practical, because this is where change happens. And we really want to get you a couple of tools to really start thinking about and working with around values. And there are um, online things that you can do, but get really honest about your current reality, right? Like that's got to be the first step. Like ask yourself, where do I feel that my life is currently out of alignment? And this is journal kind of deep work, right? That you can journal. And I'm doing this, but if you type, that's fine. But really sit and ask yourself that question: where is my life out of alignment? And what am I saying matters versus what I'm actually living? Like, because I know for me, I can see there's a couple of areas where I may not be in full alignment at the moment, right? Like I'm saying that this really matters, but am I living into that? Um, no, I'm probably sitting in that comfort versus growth conundrum at the moment, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. So, and I think, given the fact, Jason, that we're doing this and we've got other things that we're putting together and preparing, there's this comfort zone that feels secure, but then there's this growth zone, which is where I want to be. So, what or where is my life out of alignment? And what am I saying matters versus what am I actually living? So that's the first step, to get really clear on your current reality, because it's very hard to set a navigation system to where you want to go if you're not clear on where you're starting.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you need to do that kind of deep work. The second thing
And
is, go on.
Leanne, to just one little nugget there, because I think this first step can either add real magic to this work or not. And I think my biggest um, suggestion to folks is is sometimes the person or the entity that can get most in the way is your own self. So when you're doing this work that Leanne's going through, like think about that. Even if you have to have some kind of visual representation, like a little note, like this is get out of my own way, because that's where the real work is going to happen in these steps that Leanne has given you.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yes. Because we do, right? We trip ourselves up all the time. Like we absolutely do. So getting out of your own way is key. And I actually find that working with somebody else, like a coach in this space, can really help, because they're going to challenge you and stretch you and ask you different questions than you would actually do for yourself. So I think that can help. The second part, so once we're clear on our starting point, we've got to really define what are our top 3 to 5 values, not 20, not, 30. And what are our top 3 to 5? And the way that I generally get my clients to do that is to have a look at a list of, 50 or 100 values and go through and highlight the ones that stand out. And then from that list, highlight the themes that are coming through. So there's often, you'll see themes of, it might be family, connection, relationships. Like there might be themes, and it's like, okay, that's a theme. And keep doing that and culling and bringing the themes together until you've got your top 3 to 5. Because once you're clear on what it matters, that's then the kind of the litmus test for everything that you do, right? Um,
Hmm.
like if for me, connected relationships is my number one value, right? Like it really is. And that doesn't matter whether it's my colleagues, with my family, with people in the street, like connection is super important. So everything I do, it's like, is that going to build connection or is it going to harm connection? And I make decisions based on that now through the lens of my values, which I find is much better than just kind of flying by the seat of my pants. So get a big list, cull it down, cull it down, cull it down until you've got your top 3 to 5. And these are the ones that truly drive that internal state, that actually make you feel motivated, that kind of make your heart tingle as you think about them and say them. So that's step 2, right? Get your list. And then step 3 is transfer your values into behaviors. And this is where the rubber hits the road, in my opinion, because again, we can say that these things are important. So for me, if my value is connection or connected relationships, then what are some of the behaviors that I can bring in to ensure that I'm actually living it rather than just saying it? The first
Mm-hmm.
thing is, phones away at dinner, just as an example. Like that's one behavior that we do in my family. When we're at the dinner table, there are no phones, we talk. The second one is, if we're in conversation, like actually be present, not in my head thinking about, the grocery list or something else, but actually be present. It might be that I spend time intentionally with different people every week. So, I mean, I've got my kids and my family that I spend time with, but I will then allocate one person that I haven't seen for a long time and try and connect with them either by phone or preferably face to face, but not everybody lives within your vicinity. But who haven't I spoken to for a while, and actually spend the time, because connection is so important to me. So it's not just about saying that, it's about creating actions and behaviors that allow you to bring them to life. So think about that for yourself. And then the fourth one, which is the hard one, I find, is set boundaries that protect your values. Because if we're not setting those boundaries, then our values are just wishes, right? They're not actually something that we're hanging our hat on and living into. So values without boundaries really is just wishful thinking. So we need to set those boundaries, those parameters around, no, this is family time, it's connection time, where no phones, and then live to that and make sure that you've set that boundary so that you can enforce that. Um, yeah, I think it's so important. And as we've said, the fifth step here is create consistency over intensity. So these small micro steps, repeated actions that allow you to build the muscle around some of your boundaries, especially, or sorry, some of your values, especially if you're new to setting boundaries, especially if this is something that feels really uncomfortable. We're building our identity, and we're creating this alignment between what is important to us and how we're showing up in the world. Not just what we say is important, but not actually following through with. So little steps, we talk about this from week to week, micro moments that allow us to build that over time. Because values are not what we believe, right? Values are what we repeatedly do, and our priorities show what we actually value. So, Jason, do you want to speak to any of those? Because I know that you've kind of worked through this too.
Yeah, I think from a neuroscience point of view, Leanne, like especially with these like small micro consistent steps, because some people are like, I don't have enough patience for that, like I just want to, do it all in one spoke, right? But from a neuroscience point of view, and Leanne and I have talked about this area of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. It's where decision making takes place, and it gets fussy, and it has short attention spans. So actually that consistency in those small micro doses are actually helping this area of your brain work through and help you make better decisions.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
celebrating the wins too, like acknowledging that, like building that acknowledgement piece in, because then we like that. The brain likes that feel good chemical.
yeah, absolutely. And you know, and the thing is like on the boundaries piece, like, and I love how you say the values without boundaries is just wishful thinking. And like I know I can say that as I've gotten older in life, like there's just certain things, and this is from a boundary perspective, and I think that you can speak to this too, Leanne, that it's just like I'm not putting up with this in the workplace, or I'm not putting up with this within friendships or whatever. Um, and where I used to be earlier on in my life, well, kind of that loosey goosey, da da da, tiptoeing through the tulips, just to make everyone happy. And it's just like, well, shit, like, where am I compromising my own self?
And it's always us, actually. It's always us that compromises our own self. Like we can blame other people for not living to our boundaries, but it's our allowance,
Yeah.
actually. It's our allowance of that. Because people are just going to do them. And if we don't, so we have to follow through, because then
Yeah.
otherwise it is just us letting ourselves down.
Yeah. Because, over time, people, whether it's, people in your professional realm or, in your personal realm, or if some of those bleed into both, it's like people will be observant of behavior and patterns, and they're like, oh, well, Jason's like really kind of in the middle of the teeter-totter, and he can go either way with this, which is an assumption, but it's an assumption based off of what they observe, right? But it may be something that I'm not setting a clear boundary around internally. And so, if you are consistent with the boundaries that you set to your values, it may be hard. I mean, especially if it's an adjustment, it may be hard for the first little bit, but people will be like, okay, wow, like this is just a boundary that Jason has or that Leeanne has. And it's just amazing how a lot of the times then other people will shift themselves.
Well, we train
Because,
people, don't we, on how to treat us based on our boundaries and what we allow.
yeah, exactly.
So if you don't like a behavior, then you have to look within before you can kind of go external. Like, what am I allowing? And it's interesting, Jason, because boundaries for me is something that I've learned much later in life. Like, I really had uh, no prior warning or no prior training in boundaries, I should say. And boundaries can often be violated, in youth and by family systems and education systems. And for women, again, gross generalization, but it's like, suck it up, princess. You've got to kind of make peace and you've got to look after the family and you've got to do all of this sort of stuff. So we're taught basically that that's not okay in lots of ways. So I really struggled with boundaries. And every time I set one, I get so uncomfortable because of the fear of dislike and all the rest of it. But once I follow through on it, through the discomfort, what shows up later is so much pride. It's like, oh my God, you actually honored what was important to you. And how good is that? Right. And that kind of brings in a different level of enthusiasm. And then I'm much more prepared to try it again next time because I didn't have to walk away from that situation feeling shit about myself because, I let myself down again. Actually, I said no and I stood by that and I walked away empowered. That is big. So, it's never too late to do this work is what I want to say. I mean, I'm 54 and I'm still got training wheels on when it comes to boundaries and I'm not great at it, but every time I'm getting better and better.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with that, before we move into our amazing our top 3 takeaways, there's a few questions that I want to put out there for our listeners, whether you're listening live at the moment or at another time when you have time to listen to this episode. But it's a thing like, just like imagine over the next week or 2 weeks and asking yourself these questions. And if you're listening, have a piece of paper and write it down or type, whatever's most comfortable for you. The first question is, where am I out of alignment right now? Now, it's easy to go back and be like, well, 5 months ago, I was in alignment. No, okay. 5 months passed. You can't do anything about it. Where are you out of alignment present day? Okay. Then couple that with the question of what value am I saying matters, but not living? Okay. Then accompanied by the third question is, what would it take or look like to actually honor it this week? Or I'll give you 2 weeks. Like, really, what would it take? And another way that I'd actually like to phrase that question is, what are you willing to let go of that's no longer serving you so that you can honor what you need to honor this week or next week? With the last question, or not really a question, but just note that this is not about perfection. With Leeanne and I being recovering perfectionists, you can get into the analysis paralysis, right? But this is not about perfection. What it truly is about at the end of the day is your awareness and your realignment. So really take those 3 questions plus, those steps that Leeanne talked about and really dig deep. and get out of your own way, because that's where you're really going to find the magic and the uh, having your heart sing, and really empowering yourself. And I think the clarity too, when you can get out of your own way, that's when clarity also becomes much more clear. That also shows you what you should be doing in the knowing doing gap.
Yeah. And whenever
Anything else
you're,
you want to put in there,
yeah,
Leanne?
and whenever you're in conflict, ask yourself which two values are actually in conflict right now. Like, I think that's helpful as well, because then if you're clear on this, you've set your priorities, you're clear on what you need. Um, if you can ask yourself that question rather than getting into that analysis paralysis, then it's like, okay, these two values are in war. Great. Which one is my biggest priority right at this moment? And I think
Yeah.
these simple questions help us to move past being stuck, make decisions that we've been procrastinating on, and live our life in a way that's serving us today. Like, I love that first question that you asked there, Jason.
Mm-hmm.
Where am I out of alignment right now? Not
Right.
tomorrow, not next week, not next month, but just today.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah. I mean, because if we ask that question right to ourselves right now, I mean, we could easily say, well, last week I was out of alignment here. Okay, that's great. But where are you out of alignment? Like now?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you
moment
know,
to moment.
moment to moment, because you can't change the past. You can learn from it. But and as you were talking there, Leanne, I think one other question that, you know, not to overwhelm folks, but I think another question that you can ask within those series of 3 or 4 questions is also what healthy boundaries do you need to put in place? It could even just be one boundary,
Mm.
to honor that value and what matters.
Yeah,
So, I mean, I know there's people that might listen that will put out a whole 5 year plan. You don't need to put a whole 5 year plan together, but it's just that re that getting into your awareness, you know, and getting out of your own way to really be honest with yourself, like you said earlier, Leanne, like really being honest with yourself. And it's like, okay, like it's okay. It might be a little scary sometimes to be honest with yourself, but like that's where you learn, that's where you grow. Um, and that's where like just a little more happiness and joy comes into play.
yeah, totally.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add in, Leanne, before we move to
No,
the takeaway?
I mean, we could talk about this topic for hours because it's so
Yes.
valuable, but I think we need to move on to our top takeaways.
All right. Okay. Share my screen here. Okay, so as we know, we're in series 3, episodes 22 to 33, lasting from April 1st to April 2nd here in the United States, and April 2nd to June 18th in Sydney. Okay, so our top 3 takeaways from Leanne and I's conversation today. So the first takeaway is your life reflects your priorities, not your intentions. And I think that's valuable enough to say again, is your life reflects your priorities, not your intentions. Even though they may not be the priorities that you have envisioned or intended to do, but they're a priority that's in working motion for some reason. Okay. 2, values require action. And if you don't put that action behind it, they're just, well wishes, great ideas, that bestseller song that sits on the shelf that hasn't been dusted off yet. So really know that your values, and I think this goes into to show from the exercise that you gave them, Leanne, is coming up with those 3 to 5 core values. Those requires action.
Mm.
if you really want to live them. And if not, they're just great ideas. And thirdly, alignment happens through those small, consistent choices. As we were talking about, your prefrontal cortex loves micro chunking because it gives it a little break, you know? And just be patient with that, because those little small micro choices and consistent choices can end up with this like magic at the end. And so don't feel like you have to do whatever it is all in one slew. Um, be consistent about it. Anything else you want to add here, Leanne?
Yeah, I do actually, because some you might be thinking that this is just, personal values on a personal level, but also organizational values. Like, how can you operationalize them? If we've got key organizational values, we're in leadership positions, we might have these three beautiful words, but how are we actually operating? How are we operationalizing them? What behaviors would be those values? Like, do the work. Otherwise, they are just hot air out in the ether. They're not actually anything more than good ideas. And I just wanted to double click on that, because oftentimes we think of values from a personal perspective, but we can operationalize them in our personal life, but also in corporate life. So what we talked about, what behaviors are going to show up, what actions can we take that actually is in alignment with those values, and then reward people for stepping into that. So the more you see those values operationalized, the more that people will be acknowledged for it, because that's what we want to bring forward. And in our own personal life, we can be our own cheer squad, right? And celebrate for ourselves, and even share it with somebody and go, hey, I set this value and I honored it, and I'm so super proud of myself. It's so important that we do that.
Yeah. And I think that's why, amongst the combination of things, I think why people leave organizations, you know, um, whether it's at a subconscious level or one piece of the leaving pie, is because they're out of alignment with their values.
Yeah.
Or it's just hot air, like you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the organization have got these words, but they're doing the complete opposite of that. And then that's a conflict for me. So yeah, you can see it happen many, many times over.
Absolutely.
So some of the resources that we've got, as always, there's some books and some TED Talks and podcasts. I was going to say Todd Tasks, but anyway, Brené Brown. Jason and I have spoken about Brené many times before, but this exploration of courageous leadership is really about living into our values, leaning into vulnerability, and getting clear on boundaries, right? And Brené really talks to that in her book, Dare to Lead. So I highly recommend that on a personal and professional level. And then the second one is The Values Factor by John Demartini. He's got this book dives into how identifying your highest values can transform your decisions, your focus, your direction, and it provides practical tools to align your daily actions to what truly matters. So everything that we've talked about, this book kind of helps you with. So again, good recommendation of something to read if you haven't already. And then there's a couple of podcasts or TED Talks here. Not podcasts, TED Talks and YouTubes. The first one is What Makes a Good Life? Lessons from the Longest Study on Earth. They studied people over an 80 years, right? And looked at, what actually makes a good life. It's not wealth and fame. It's actually the relationships that we have and how we show up for ourselves, right? That's what the goods are. So very good to listen to. Ruth Chang also, How to Make Hard Choices. I found that one really interesting when I listened to it, because we tell our story that something's a hard choice, but is it really? They're just two different choices. So if you struggle with making decisions, I think that one's a really good one to listen to. And then obviously Carol Dweck, who talks about the power of believing that you can improve. So this growth mindset that we can bring into our world. Because when we think we can, then we can. Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. Because whatever you believe about yourself is what will show up. So Carol Dweck is also a good one. And the last one is Andrew Huberman, Habits, Behaviour and Consistency. So I think that's a good one to watch as well. Around, it kind of links to the habits that we have, the behaviors that we do, and it brings a neuroscience layer into what we've been discussing, of why we don't follow through when we actually value something. So I think that's a good one as well. So we'll put the links to the resources in our usual place on our channel.
Yes, thank you, Leeanne. And as always, we love to advertise our next episode, episode 25. It's just amazing how we're inching towards 30 episodes. And next week's episode will be on energy over everything, winning your day without burning out. So Leanne and I are excited for next week's conversation, to give you the goods, to give you some tools and resources to winning your day without burnout. And so that's next week. I can't believe it's already almost the end of April already. April 22nd here in the States at 4:30 p.m. Pacific time, and April 23rd on Thursday in Sydney at 9:30 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And as always, this is a quick snapshot of the rest of our episodes. And with that, we are ready for our closeout.
Absolutely. So just before we leave you today, I really want you to think about what's one value you say that matters that your life isn't currently reflecting, and then do something about that.
Yeah. Love that.
Yeah.
It makes me want to do my own work.
Yeah. I know, right?
So, as always, thank you for joining us for today's conversation on values and action. Stop saying what matters and start living it.
Yeah. We hope that it sparks something new, an insight, a fresh perspective, or even just a question or two now that you're going to spend time exploring.
This week and next week.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And as always, our mission here at Let's Talk is simple: to have the conversations that matter and to remind you that you don't have to do this sometimes complicated, scary thing called life alone. We're here to have those conversations alongside of you and to help give you tools and resources to live more intentionally with life.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're part of your courage circle or your inner circle of colleagues that you can lean on and speak to. So if you enjoyed today's episode, please share with a friend, like, subscribe, do all the things, and keep the conversation going with us.
Because when we talk,
we really talk.
And anything is possible.
So let's talk.
With real conversations.
And limitless possibilities. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.